last hour. Paul Manafort responds. The president's former campaign chair is now punching back after reports that he was allegedly wiretapped before and after the election. Here is a new statement just now into our newsroom from Manafort's spokesman, and I'm going to unpack it for you. First, he says, quote, "If true, it is a felony to reveal the existence of a FISA warrant, those foreign surveillance warrants, regardless of the fact that no charges ever emerged. The DOJ's Inspector General should immediately conduct an investigation into these leaks, which I'll explain, and to examine the motivations behind a previous administration's effort to surveil a political opponent." Manafort also demanding right now that if there are transcripts, the DOJ should release them now. Now, the context, these alleged wiretaps were continuing into this year when Manafort was known to speak with President Trump, and it's, quote, "unclear whether Trump himself was picked up on the surveillance," according to that CNN account. And that's not all. The other bombshell story still reverberating today, the New York Times reporting that after that early morning raid on Manafort's house in July, Mueller's team informed Manafort they did plan to indict him. Meanwhile, another top Trump aide today is laying out a public defense. This is new. Michael Cohen, Trump's personal attorney and the executive who infamously asked the Kremlin for help with a Trump business project in Moscow in 2016, was out there in the Senate today denying that either he or Trump colluded with the Russians, and he got specific. Let me explain. He said he was never paid by the Russians or anyone else to hack or interfere with the election, to hack Democratic Party computers, or specifically, he denied creating fake news stories to assist the Trump campaign. All of that from Cohen's opening statement to Senate investigators, which we would normally be reporting on a day like this, but this was no normal day, because after Cohen emerged from behind closed doors for just over an hour, and you see him there with his lawyer in the Senate Hart office building, something weird happened.
The committee has chosen to postpone today's meeting today.
Can you say why was it postponed? Why was it postponed?
That's a question you're going to have to ask the Senate.
But it wasn't because of you. What did you think for that hour? Was it your request to postpone? Was it your request to postpone, or was it already you or the committee?
What were you doing here today if you weren't me?
It was a request of the Senate Intel to postpone, and I'll be back, and I look forward to getting all the information that they're looking for.
That body language is what it looks like when one lawyer is trying to get his client, another lawyer, to not speak to the press, although we lawyers sometimes, we can't stop speaking. Now, here's what's important here. The Senate leaders did later say Cohen should not have released that statement I just read to you, and that they want him to now testify in public on October 25th. They are treating this as a breach. So as these investigations all close in, today we are seeing some strong reactions. Cohen breaking his agreement with those Senate investigators. That's at least according to the chairman and ranking member from both parties. And then Manafort pushing back on this allegation that he was targeted in a wiretap and suggesting that if he was, this may raise the specter of Obama administration political retribution. I'm lucky to say we have a great panel to digest all of this. NBC's chief White House correspondent, Hallie Jackson, has been covering these stories for some time. Former Watergate prosecutor Nick Ackerman, a partner at Dorsey and Whitney, and Ann Gearan of the Washington Post, a veteran of many of the issues I just mentioned. I want to start with you, Nick, on this brand new Manafort statement. In fairness to Paul Manafort, ending up in surveillance doesn't mean you automatically did anything wrong. His statement does not suggest a formal confirmation of this account. And there are, as we've explained before, and I'm going to have a bigger legal dive later in the show, there are multiple ways to end up in a surveillance stream. What do you view as the work he's doing in this statement, and how ominous or acerbic do you see this reference to political opponents?
Oh, I think, look, they went into a federal judge with probable cause, a very detailed affidavit that set out exactly why it was they wanted to put that wiretap on his phone. They followed the law. The judge directed that there be this wiretap, and they were able to do it again later on after they had stopped it. These affidavits are not something that's a couple pieces of paper. I mean, this is something that is quite extensive, that can go for 30, 40, 50 pages.
What about Manafort's concern that if it is leaking, that itself is a crime?
It may be. It depends who leaked it. Yeah, sure, it can be a crime. And he wouldn't know one way or the other, to tell you the truth, whether or not he had been the subject of such a surveillance.
Right.
So this whole thing could be a lot of nothing. On the other hand, he has been told he's going to be indicted. He's been given a target.
Right, according to that Target reporting.
Right.
And Giron, there's been a lot of adjectives thrown around: red hot, high stakes, shock and awe. I don't know that those are that helpful for understanding the investigation. I do think that some of the leaks we're seeing suggest the stage we're in. I want to read to you from Susan Hennessy, who's a former counsel at NSA. She says, Mueller's investigation has reached a critical stage. He may soon start making allegations in public. The search warrant for Facebook is indication of investigation reaching critical mass. The idea that these aren't just leaks from people touched by it, but rather they're going somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, Mueller has, over the last several months, not only amassed a large staff of investigators who are looking into, from what we can tell by what we know of what they're looking at and their own backgrounds as investigators, the potential for financial crimes, the potential for shenanigans in past business deals, and obviously any nexus to Russia. Given the length of time that those investigators have all been working and what we're now seeing happening with Manafort, it's logical to assume that Mueller is getting close to the point when he either brings an indictment or threatens an indictment in order to get something else he wants. I wanted to say one thing about FISA, though. I mean, it's not one judge; it's a panel of judges. It's a large, it's a secret court of federal judges who have to review these requests from the federal government before they grant a FISA a warrant for an investigation, which would then lead to the wiretap. And it has to involve a foreign subject. So, if in fact Manafort was the subject of a FISA warrant that allowed the wiretap, it's because they would have thought or had probable cause to think that he was doing something nefarious with a foreign power, foreign business person, foreign something, or they wouldn't have been before FISA at all.
So Paul Manafort's spokesperson's statement that just came out a couple of minutes before the show does a couple of things, Ann and Nick. And when you look at the discussion of threatening an indictment, there has been a lot of talk of that in that New York Times piece, and that is exactly what happened. To see who exactly is going to flip, what will they say, and how much will they say. All of that right now as it relates to Manafort and Mike Flynn is speculation, but it is certainly going to be a factor that we're going to be looking at over the next period of months. Here's what the spokesperson for Paul Manafort did. He threw up a shiny object and said, hey, this could be a crime. And as you point out, he's right. It could actually be a felony. But the other part of it is he said, hey, release it all. I call on the Department of Justice to release everything. Take a look. My client did nothing wrong. That is never going to happen. They had nothing to lose by coming out and saying this.
You're not, hold on, Hallie Jackson. You're not suggesting that these lawyers for Paul Manafort would make a demand upon the government about which they know the government cannot comply.
I'm just saying, from a PR perspective, that statement did what it needed to do. But you know what it didn't do? It didn't say anything about the veracity or not of that report.
Well, that's the most interesting part. And again, I say this a lot, and sometimes people think I'm being annoying. It is true, in fairness to people caught up in investigation, that being caught on surveillance or being interviewed or going in for the grand jury doesn't mean anything automatically negative. We say that a lot around here. The response, though, here has not been to speak publicly to this report about the targeting or about whether he's facing an indictment threat or basically an indication of being a target. It is much more, as you say, to throw it back at them and say, well, maybe you should be under the gun. Meanwhile, the politics of this, which I want to get you on because you were all over 2016 campaign trail, is was Paul Manafort the most important person with these high-level contacts, both in the Trump campaign and apparently going to Russia meetings, or was he some guy that no one can remember? I want to show Donald Trump at the convention when he did seem to know who Paul Manafort was. RNC convention, Donald Trump.
Paul Manafort has done an amazing job. He's here someplace. Where's Paul? Paul Manafort. Oh, good. You made it. Paul Manafort has done a fantastic, and all of Paul's people. Paul brought on a staff, and we really do. We have a great staff of talented people, a great staff.
Hallie, is that the truth, or is it the later Sean Spicer denial that this was some rando volunteer?
And the implication that Paul Manafort really had nothing to do with the campaign. No, that is not the case. case, right? You can say all you want after the fact that Paul Manafort, wasn't involved, that he was a peripheral player. He was not. He came in. Remember the context of when he came in. This moment when the never Trump drum beaters were sounding the alarm, when you thought, hey, maybe there is a chance, when we were out there covering the primaries that, K-Stick's going to do something, there might be delegate drama. So Paul Manafort was brought in for that, to try to work the room there, and then ended up elevated, right, to this position of importance inside the campaign. He was the de facto campaign manager, Ari, until all this Russia stuff and his connections to Viktor Yanukovych and all these other people started trickling out. And he himself acknowledged when he stepped back, he said, I don't want it to be about me, right? I want it to be about the then candidate Donald Trump and his campaign and what he's pushing for. But the bottom line is, yes, he was involved. You might hear Sean Spicer or whomever say, nah, he was just a sideline player. That is noise. That is not the case.
He was a turnaround artist. He was the guy who was supposed to come in and fix the campaign when things were falling apart. Trump kept doing stuff every day that made his own situation worse. Delegates were peeling off. Supporters were peeling off.
His family members weren't a fan of Corey Lewandowski.
Right. They're like, and here was this guy, this experienced Republican hand, who, had spent the last several years doing stuff that people were a little unsure about, involving foreign clients. But his background was as somebody who understood the delegate process, somebody who understood the Republican convention rules, and he was supposed to fix things.
But don't forget, he was also the person that was at that June 9th meeting at Trump Tower. I mean, he was there with Don Jr., he was there with Kushner, he was there with all of the Russians when they were supposed to show up with all of these documents that incriminated Hillary Clinton. So he was a key person in this whole Russian situation, as well as the campaign.
And Hallie, why was he working for free for the Trump campaign?
Because it served his interest. I mean, one perhaps charitable explanation, and one that you had heard from folks at the time, was that he was a guy who was not like a player in politics at the moment. He had been around a long time before. He was considered kind of this guy from the old guard coming back. When he came back, I think a lot of people went, wow, him? Pulled out the photo albums from back in the day. So perhaps he saw it, if you're going to look at it from one perspective, as a chance to try to reobtain some relevancy inside the political sphere in D.C., make some connections. He had a consulting firm, not the worst thing in the world, to get your name attached to a guy who was heading over to the RNC. That's one explanation.
Yeah, but don't forget, he was brought in by Roger Stone. Roger Stone was the individual that put him in there as campaign manager. He recommended him to Donald Trump.
What is the investigative significance of the ongoing conversations between Manafort and Trump, reportedly occurring long after he'd vacated the campaign?
Well, the significance is that Donald Trump could have put himself in the soup by saying something incriminating. What were they talking about?
You think it's possible that the president is on a tape somewhere? We talk about the Nixon tapes. He set up those tapes. You think it's possible that President Donald Trump, not during the campaign, but after the November election, could be on a tape that Mueller has?
It could be. I mean, because what were they talking about? Manafort presumably had nothing to do with the president at that point. And it was at that point that Trump was saying, oh, this guy really had nothing to do with me and nothing to do with the campaign.
Yeah, a lot of questions. And I will note the obvious, which sometimes, it's our job. We anchor, and sometimes we say obvious things. But there have been a lot of reports that Paul Manafort has not come out and specifically addressed. He has been a fairly quiet person in this inquiry. Tonight, here within the last hour, him breaking his silence to his spokesperson. Hallie Jackson, Nick Ackerman, Ann Guerin at Power Panel, thank you so much. So how exactly does the FBI do this kind of secret surveillance? I have a legal breakdown. I'm going to walk it through for all of you right after the break. And does this new Republican health care bill pass the so-called Kimmel test? The late-night host tweeting he is going to weigh in on that in his monologue tonight. I have an exclusive interview with Senator Chris Murphy. All that plus the world's reaction to Trump's debut at the UN and those comments about, quote, destroying North Korea. I'm Ari Melber, and you're watching The Beat on MSNBC.
America's beverage companies have come together to bring...
Now to our breakdown. That CNN report that the feds wiretapped Trump aide Paul Manafort, which NBC has not confirmed, has an explosive account in it that secret evidence suggests, quote, Manafort encouraged Russians to help the Trump campaign. Now, that's a big claim that evidence indicates the head of Trump's campaign was encouraging Russian meddling. But what is the evidence? Let's break down the long legal road that may have led to a wiretap of Paul Manafort. Reportedly, the feds began looking at him as the subject of an investigation in 2014. scrutinizing his work in Ukraine, including with Russia-friendly operatives. Now, that inquiry was discontinued sometime last year with no charges for a lack of evidence. Manafort was then reportedly tapped again in some manner in the fall of 2016 and early 2017, part of the FBI's efforts to investigate ties between the Trump campaign associates and Russian operatives. Now, Manafort, of course, was fired in 2016, August of that year, and he continued conversations with Donald Trump before and after the election. This could include the time that he was allegedly tapped. Quote, Manafort and Trump kept talking by phone until lawyers for the president and Manafort insisted that they stop. So that is the background. But legally, how do one of these wiretaps come about? Well, let me walk you through it. The FBI first can ask the DOJ to make a wiretap request. Then the DOJ decides if it has a legal case for a warrant, and for these types of foreign warrants, the request then goes to a special secret foreign surveillance court. If anything out of that court warrant that's approved is used and becomes lawful evidence, it can go into any court case. The question of whether there is evidence here. Now, Manafort is not only not confirming this story, but within the last hour says if there is any evidence, he's asking for it to be immediately released. Now, with me now for more is former FBI agent Clint Watts and former federal prosecutor Cynthia Alskny. I want to ask you, Clint, if you get a warrant to do it, how does this tap work, and what do you get out of it for the authorities?
Yeah, so it has to be limited to an individual and a scope, meaning that whenever the application goes forward, you can't collect information on everything. Even if it is collected, it needs to be minimized. So anything that isn't pertaining to your actual investigation has to be narrowed down and minimized to protect any innocent people that come in or anything that's outside of that scope. So it can become a very narrow tool. Once that's employed, then it goes to dedicated communication devices that are confirmed to be with that person or known to be connected with that person. So it could be email addresses, phone numbers, things like that. That's where the actual collection is done, and that would be done through whatever the provider of that communication service is. So it is very narrow, and there's a key thing that people should remember about the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. It is about state sponsors, either a foreign terrorist organization or a state sponsor of espionage, and the standard is lower. You're looking for a probable cause that somebody is an agent of a foreign power. It does not mean that they are involved in any criminal activity. And important to know in this story is that this was picked up, it sounds like, overseas. There was some sort of intercept that must have mentioned Manafort. So they may have been trying to actually pull this application together, not just to see was he an agent, but to see if there's any connection or anything of value related to it. So I think people need to be careful not to move too far down the road with their assumptions when we really don't know what the target of this was or what the scope of it was.
Right, and you're speaking to an important point that's come up a lot. And Cynthia, we've cited reporting by CNN that, again, I mentioned NBC News has not confirmed about the notion that Manafort is being picked up in this surveillance. One possibility is that he was explicitly targeted. The other is, of course, as we've reported many times, people can get picked up in surveillance in all sorts of ways. But if he was targeted, and if, as I quoted, there were discussions with the president, could those ever be used in a potential case?
Well, they could be, but first of all, we don't know what the conversations are, and we have to be careful not to jump to conclusions what the conversations would be about. And according to the way these warrants they work, it's very important if he starts a conversation with the president about Thanksgiving, they're not supposed to listen to that. They're only supposed to listen to what has to do within the scope of the warrant. So it really depends on, you know, what was said, and if it falls within the scope, and if it's a criminal.
Well, and how do they do that? Because you could imagine a conversation with a person, be it Donald Trump or any other person, might jump from topic to topic.
Right. Well, they make a determination. They're trained. They make a determination, and if it seems like it's about something totally unnecessary or unimportant, they turn it off and they stop listening.
Clint, when it comes to the Secret Surveillance Court, it has, by the way, been a matter of some controversy on the left and the right for being too permissive, for granting warrants to just about anyone, and then there's a counter argument that no, it's a rigorous process, and the reason why the acceptance rate, the warrant rate, is high is because people only go in there when they really have espionage and other bad stuff, to use a legal term of art. Let me play for you Jim Comey describing what he thought the thickness, the requirements were just to get these kind of warrants.
Yeah.
Well, let me play it.
The FISA applications are almost always, I have skinny wrists, but significantly thicker than my wrist. It is a pain in the neck to get permission to conduct electronic surveillance in the United States. A pain in the neck. And that's great.
The pain in the neck standard, if you will, is the idea that you really have to have something to get in there. How do you view it?
Yeah, I agree completely with that assessment. It is the most intrusive and most difficult form of an investigation tool that you will ever try and go after as an investigator, and it's very difficult to get. The amount of evidence that you have to build up for it, the reporting requirements that go along with it are very significant, and they take an overwhelming amount of manpower to actually keep up with. So any investigator that's going to push for that level of intrusiveness and that technique is going to put in a lot of hard work, do a lot of evidence collection, and only those applications that are sound actually move forward to the actual court for some sort of ruling on it. So I do agree that the only reason that you see a very low declination rate, essentially, that comes on those applications is because there's such a rigorous process to get there, and you always try and avoid using that technique at all costs.
And Cynthia, in cases you've worked, do you find that individuals who ought to know better, folks involved in on the periphery of a criminal enterprise or otherwise engaged in ongoing unlawful conduct, still end up saying things they shouldn't say, and that's why these taps are valuable? Because folks
It's
watching
shocking.
at home and watching movies think, yeah, go ahead.
It is shocking what they say. But I want to echo what Clint said, because I think it's really important, and that is not only is the FISA court very rigorous about what it's willing to grant, but there's a huge process at the FBI, and it's a big bureaucracy, and you've got to go through all the steps, and then it goes to justice, and you go through stacks and stacks of steps and approvals. It's not easy to get these warrants.
Stacks on stacks on stacks.
Stacks on stacks. A lot of bureaucracy.
Amen. Well, sometimes people say that's good for people's Fourth Amendment rights. Clint and Cynthia, thank you both for your expertise on this.
Thank you.
Coming up, does the new GOP healthcare pass that famous Kimmel test? He's actually going to weigh in on that, and I'm going to speak with Democratic Senator Chris Murphy. Plus, President Trump facing a room full of world leaders vowing to take on North Korea and dubbing Kim Jong-un Rocket Man. What was wrong with that?
Any update on where you stand on Graham Cassidy?
Nope.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
I have a lot of concerns, and it's very difficult to evaluate a bill when you don't have the CBO analysis.
No CBO numbers yet, and Republicans know this is it as a parliamentary matter. Lindsey Graham, who named the bill and obviously co-sponsored it, has warned if it doesn't pass, Republicans could face something they think is terrifying.
Paul Ryan told me to my face, if you pass it, we pass it. You can have different opinions about the quality of this bill. At the end of the day, this is the only process left available to stop a march towards socialism. It's pretty well clear to me where the country's going under Obamacare and Bernie Care.
Bernie Care. Rachel Bade is a congressional reporter for Politico covering health care. Leo Wright-Rivera, historian from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and Dr. Howard Dean, former governor and DNC chair. Governor Doctor, I start with you. A march towards socialism.
You know, Lindsey I like a lot of his foreign policy. He should stick to foreign policy. This is ignorant. The truth is, this is an insurance-based bill. It was written as an insurance-based bill, and it was written by people from the insurance industry. This would be ridiculous, this kind of talk.
When you say insurance-based,
yeah,
you mean it's going to help companies more than patients?
I don't want to talk about Graham's bill. I mean, talking about Obamacare was a bill written by and for insurance companies. It does do a lot of good things. But to say it's socialism is ridiculous. It's a private sector bill.
Right.
It's a silly thing to say, and it's not true.
Right. You're saying that Lindsey Graham is full of it because he's literally referencing a market-based solution.
I wouldn't say he was full of it. I just say he doesn't know anything about health care, and he should stick to foreign policy because that's his area of expertise.
Governor, you'd never say anything like that.
And furthermore, Cassidy is a doctor. He should know better. He's going to take $2 billion away from the people of Louisiana if this bill passes. That's his home constituency. They pay his salary, not the Koch brothers. Get with the program and stop this ridiculous bill.
Professor Rigor, building on that point and how this affects people, pre-existing conditions, a lot of discussion about that. I want to read here from an analysis from the Center on Budget Policy Priorities. Insurers would still be required to offer coverage to people with pre-existing conditions, but they could offer them plans with unaffordable premiums of thousands or tens of thousands of dollars per month. What does that mean?
So it feels a little bit like we're experiencing some deja vu here, right? Different day, slightly tweaked plan that still doesn't pass, you know, if you want to be colloquial, but it still doesn't pass the Kimmel test in terms of providing people with affordable and accessible health care. And so this is the real problem. This is the dilemma for the GOP, kind of rushing these things in here without having a CBO score and having a bill that inherently does not allow people to have really good and quality health care, and also makes cuts in areas that even Republican senators have said are, you know, over the line, just too much in terms of providing health care for their people. I think, you know, to Governor Dean's point, you know, 33% of Americans support single payer. 60% of Americans think that the government should be responsible for health care, and that's something that the Republican Party really has to take into account.
And Rachel, the issue seems to be the closer Republicans get in public perception to undermining Obamacare, the harder it is to do. And so there was a whole big fight, then they lost. Everyone remembers McCain's no vote. Now it seems to be creeping back, and I think for normal people around the country, you go, well, is this real? Is this happening? Are they closer? What's your view?
No, this certainly has an uphill battle, and they have some whipping to do if they think they're going to get this passed. You're going to see, as you're talking about now, a lot of the same debates right now where conservatives want to take this bill a little further to the right, and then you have more moderate centrist Republicans who are worried about their constituents losing health care, getting kicked off Medicaid. So I think my Republican sources on the Hill are basically telling me that there's something different right now, and that is that we're nearly 10 months into the year, and they don't have a single big legislative accomplishment coming out of Congress. Trump is getting mad. He's, you know, having Chinese food with Chuck and Nancy and cutting deals with Democrats on the debt ceiling. He's talking about working with them on DACA and tax reform. They're saying this as a warning shot right now, and they want to get their act together and show him that they can do something, not only just for him, but for themselves and for the midterm elections as well.
Right. Well, Governor Dean, as you know, Bob Marley, among others, said every little action, there is a reaction. And so maybe dinner with Chuck and Nancy, the reaction is House Republicans demanding another go at this. Your view of the politics there, which you know quite well.
The politics is money. The Koch brothers have basically told Paul Ryan they're not going to help unless they get rid of this bill. So this is about money from the Koch brothers. I think it's a disgusting undermining of American health care and American politics. There are, I mean, I can't imagine Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, who voted against this before and got a hero's welcome at home, are going to vote for this. I can't believe Shelley Moore Capito is even thinking about this. West Virginia is one of the most Medicaid-dependent states in the entire country. This is totally contrary to what the people of their own party who voted for Donald Trump want or need.
Well, and to that point, Governor, this isn't negotiation towards some other middle ground. I mean, I want to put up on the screen what's in the Graham-Cassidy bill, because we get all these different terms flying around. Some of the key points to know: no true protection for pre-existing conditions, a gutting of those essential health benefits, ending the Medicaid expansion, which is not only, of course, people who might have less annual income, but is also an overwhelming number of seniors and people with disabilities who need that, and then repealing the mandate. So as far as I understand it, and you're the doctor, but as far as I understand it, this is in some ways a harsher version of reform than earlier Trump care.
This is a worse version of reform, and besides that, it takes money away from the states, both Republican and Democrat, who did the right thing and insured as many people as possible, and gives it to the states who did nothing, like Lindsey Graham's state. It is a disgraceful bill. It's based on money and envy, and there's no merit to this whatsoever.
And Rachel, speak to the policy point the governor just raised, which is something that Rand Paul also noted. The criticism that this bill basically tries to shuffle money specifically over into Republican states.
Look, I think that you have a lot of people in Congress who are concerned about how states that took the Medicaid expansion are basically, what is going to happen to them? What is going to happen to them when they lose a bunch of this money that they're using to help people who can't afford health care right now? So I think that the policy debate, or that policy point, is absolutely valid. But you also have to look at Republicans are hearing from the more traditional wing of the Republican Party and the further right side of the Republican Party, and they're talking about driving down prices. And, you know, yes, people are worried about people with pre-existing conditions and those folks being priced out of the market. But if you talk to conservatives on the Hill, they'll argue that, you know, we got to do this to bring down prices, and we got to think about what's best for, you know, the majority of Americans. So it's, you know, it's not that a lot of Republicans don't want to do this. In fact, I would say that probably 80% of my sources and lawmakers on the Hill that are Republican want to do this and are not really concerned about all these other things.
Right. All these other things being, I think, some of what we've been discussing, the gap between the political pressure and what is actually a comprehensive health care plan that's going to work at the state level, because this will be judged, if it passes, for years to come. Rachel Bade, Leah Wright-Rigueur, and Howard Dean, thank you all. I appreciate it. Now ahead, whether the health care bill can pass the Kimmel test. As I mentioned, I'm going to speak with Senator Chris Murphy, and Donald Trump bringing his Twitter insults all the way to the UN.
This place is cool.
As a software factory should be.
So it runs on software?
It is software, enabling nationwide. Prevagen, the name to remember.
There are some pundits who like to talk about, you know, those moments when Donald Trump became the president. Well, maybe today was not one of them.
The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime.
How did it play? Well, there's Trump's chief of staff, John Kelly, during the speech at the UN. Now, this is just a moment in time. We don't know what Kelly is thinking there as he puts his hand to his face, but getting a lot of attention, that picture. Also, world leaders looking on, at times stone-faced, as Trump warned of a, quote, hell on earth, and boasted about America going it alone.
Major portions of the world are in conflict, and some, in fact, are going to hell. I will always put America first. We can no longer be taken advantage of or enter into a one-sided deal.
With me now is David Ignatius, foreign columnist and associate editor for The Washington Post, covering Trump's speech. How do our allies view Trump's performance today? And he talks about the most surprising thing in the speech. What is it?
To me, Ari, this may shock your viewers, the most surprising thing when you got past the grossly undiplomatic language was what a conventional speech it was. I thought he didn't add any new specific threats about Iran tearing up the agreement. He was surprisingly supportive of the United Nations as an institution, as a conflict solver. He said at one point, dealing with North Korea really is the problem of the United Nations, or should be the job of the United Nations. I thought the rhetorical overkill was so pronounced that it, I think, leads people to overlook what are, to me, some important aspects of the speech. This was a president who 9 months ago, I thought, was setting out to basically wreck the international system on which the United States is dependent for its security, its prosperity. And I saw the language in this speech, contrasted even with his inaugural speech, to be different and more supportive. It was a president who was accepting that the international institutions, the UN in particular, matter to the United States. And I just would note that. I mean, I'm not going to tell you that I think that was the right language to use talking about Rocket Man, but I think it's worth looking at some of the details in this speech, because they really do contrast with where he seemed to be at the beginning of his presidency.
Well, I think what you're articulating here in this annual sort of historic forum is very familiar to our viewers. Not to suck up to my viewers, but I think they follow politics closely and know that Donald Trump has a long history of trying to get credit for screaming about things without ever doing anything about them, whether that's the swamp or the wall, or now a slightly more, perhaps internationally esoteric set of issues about whether or not he's actually going to do anything about how the United Nations runs, or whether the dues structure changes, or who's on the Security Council, or how these things are negotiated. I mean, there's a lot of stuff there that he may just be screaming about. I will play for you his Reagan-esque moment of attacking the UN, although with his typical Trumpian over flair. Take a listen.
The United Nations is not a friend of democracy. It's not a friend to freedom. It's not a friend even to the United States of America, where, as you know, it has its home.
Did you ever hear that the United Nations solved a problem? It's become a political hornet's nest. The United States pays much more than anybody else, even though other people benefit much more than we do. So we're going to get it stopped.
So that was him telling his supporters this is how he's going to deal with the UN. Did he say it to their face today, or did you find he focused on other issues?
I thought that he made several important statements about the UN over the last 2 days. I thought in Monday's sort of odd session to discuss UN reform, he very much committed himself and his, I think, his favorite diplomat, Nikki Haley, to this project of UN reform, which does matter. Anybody who follows the UN knows that it really is too bureaucratic, it wastes too much money. I mean, Trump is far from alone in thinking that. The new Secretary General, Guterres, is quite aggressive on these reform issues. He now has strong direct support from Trump. Another thing that I was really pleased to see, I've been distressed, as I think many observers have been, by the way in which Rex Tillerson, as Secretary of State, has backed away from human rights issues. So I was noted with interest that Trump specifically called out the UN human rights body, which does have too many human rights violators as members, and said that that's not appropriate. And I think, again, observers of the UN who'd like to see it be more active wouldn't disagree with that.
Right. So a few reasonable ideas tucked under the Rocket Man headline. Out of time, David Ignatius, thank you so much.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now, does the new GOP health care bill pass the Kimmel test? The host responding tonight. I'm going to talk about it with Senator Chris Murphy.
Getting your flu shot at Walgreens?
They did an echocardiogram, which is a sonogram of the heart, and found that Billy was born with a heart disease. If your baby is going to die, and it doesn't have to, it shouldn't matter how much money you make. I think that's something that, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or something else, we all agree on that, right? I mean, we do.
Then Republican Senator Ben Cassidy pledged to uphold a Kimmel test about any health care bill that he would support. Now, many analysts say Cassidy's new bill doesn't come close to passing that test. And late today, Jimmy Kimmel tweeting this photo with his son and writing, "Billy's helping me write tonight's monologue. I'll give our thoughts on the Graham-Cassidy health care bill." I'm joined by Senator Chris Murphy, Democrat from Connecticut, a member of the relevant committee who has been speaking out on this all over the place. Thanks for making time on a busy day. First, this question, in your view, does this fail the Kimmel test, and thus is Senator Cassidy going back on his word?
This is a big fat F. This fails the Kimmel test worse than any other version of Trump care. And the irony of this is that the reason that Bill Cassidy was on that show is because he proactively made a statement during the prior debate that any bill that Republicans consider should pass the Kimmel test. That's why he got to be on primetime late night TV. And the bill that his name is now attached to violates that test in a way that none of the other previous versions did. The reason for that is that it, A, allows every state to waive the protections for people with pre-existing conditions, and then it essentially requires them to waive that protection because it gets rid of the individual mandate. Without the individual mandate, every single insurance executive and expert will tell you that you cannot protect people with pre-existing conditions.
So Senator,
this bill eliminates those protections.
On that policy point, which is so important, you're saying that under the facts of the bill, this new proposal, this new step stab at repealing Obamacare or doing some Trump care would make it easier to discriminate against people with those conditions at the state level?
It will guarantee that states have to remove the protection for people with pre-existing conditions, because without a mandate for healthy people to buy insurance, no state can require insurance companies to charge sick people and healthy people the same thing. So this is the first version of the bill that has been introduced. This is the 7th version. This is the first version that's been introduced that proactively forces states to repeal the protection for people with pre-existing conditions. It's the most extreme on this issue, and the irony is it's the guy who said that he was going to stand up for people with pre-existing conditions that's introducing it.
Right. Irony being a very nice word for it, and I know that you are a collegial senator. Another word here on the facts would be blanket and obvious hypocrisy, given his prior claims to want to do something for people with those conditions. Let me ask you this way. That's the policy. What about the politics? Health care is something that Republicans did get clobbered on, that did become a source of a civil war between Donald Trump, the president, and the party, the blame, the tweets. Do you know politically why they're going back at it, and do you think they have a better chance this time?
Well, the issue of repealing health care is kind of like the zombie apocalypse for Republicans. It won't die. And I think they remain worried about a very small sliver of the Republican base that may give them trouble when primary time comes around. The overall numbers are the same. When polls come out about this version of Trump care, it'll still be at about a 17-20% approval rating. But, you know, they're worried about a small segment of Trump loyalists in the Republican Party that might come after them if they don't pass this. It's all about politics. It has nothing to do with policy, and the end result is that a lot of people are going to get hurt and a lot of people are going to die if this bill passes.
Turning to Russia, while I have you, new reports that Paul Manafort may indeed be a target of the Mueller investigation. That is to say that he could face future indictment, and that he was wiretapped for his contact with foreigners, and that some investigators believe he was seeking Russian help to tip the election. Do you view these new reports as something we have to wait and see and unpack, or does it look to you like a key element in the case that there was some kind of collusion?
Well, I mean, the smoke continues to billow and billow, and it's really hard to believe that there isn't fire underneath. I think you have to go back to the beginning. Paul Manafort was a very curious choice to be campaign manager. He had largely been out of U.S. politics for a very long time and never managed a race like this. His only real qualification was that he had been working in Ukrainian and Russian politics over the course of the better part of a decade. So you have to ask, why was he picked in the first place? Was it because of his connections to Russia? And maybe Mueller is starting to pursue some of those questions right now.
And finally, do you think President Donald Trump may have to ultimately testify? Are you prepared to rule that in or out?
He absolutely may have to testify. In the end, you know, Mueller's going to have to answer one central question. Did the President of the United States know about collusion between his campaign and the Russian government if they can prove that it happened? So first, he's going to try to figure out whether the proof of that collusion exists. More evidence suggests that it did today than 6 months ago. The second question will have to be whether Donald Trump knew about it, and only Donald Trump can answer that question, really.
Only Donald Trump. Interesting. Senator
Well,
Murphy.
not only Donald Trump. There's other people that can answer that, but he would be obviously definitive on that question.
Right. Senator Murphy, thank you for making time on a busy day.
Thanks.
And that's our show. You can always find us on Facebook or Twitter at The Beat with Ari, or email me. Thanks for watching. Hardball with Chris Matthews starts right now.
Don't mess with Mueller. Let's play hardball.